Connect like minds.
Hi, thanks for checking out Connect Like Minds. I'm your host, Sharice, and today my special guest is a journalist who's written for news outlets such as The Washington Post, The Daily Beast, and Newsweek, just to name a few. He's reported issues dealing with law enforcement and the military. He's also a professor here at UNCW and the author of 2 books, one that's already out right now called The Aluminum Alley, and his other will be out soon. But we'll get into that later. He's a mentor and friend to me. Welcome to the Connect Like Minds podcast, Rory Laverty.
Thank you very much, Sharice. It's nice to be here.
Man, it's a pleasure to have you here. I'm super excited and just a tad bit nervous.
Me too.
But we're going to jump right into the interview. So tell everyone where you're from.
Okay, well, I'm from Los Angeles, but I was actually born on a Navy base in Newport, Rhode Island during the tail end of the Vietnam War. My dad was a JAG there, and after the war ended, he and my mom moved back to North Hollywood when I was a toddler. And I spent my early years in LA, mostly in the South Bay, Manhattan Beach.
Okay, that's cool. Now, how was life growing up for you being in a 2-parent household?
Well, I was in a 2-parent household for about 4 years.
Okay.
And then they got separated. And so they moved apart but lived in the same town in Manhattan Beach for about 3 years. And then my mom moved up to Palo Alto to get her PhD in psychology. So then they were split up, and at first I moved up to Palo Alto for 2 years, and I would come back on weekends to LA, and then I moved back to LA and I would go to Palo Alto for weekends, or like 1 weekend a month kind of thing.
That was a lot. How did you feel about that?
I didn't really feel a lot about it, at least consciously and rationally, but I think it affected me a lot and made me some of who I am was that experience.
Okay. Now, you're a professor and a journalist. When you were a kid, was that something that you grew up dreaming about, or is that something that happened later?
I wanted to be a novelist, always. And it's probably because I just read so many novels. That was my thing, I was a big reader when a lot of other kids weren't reading yet. So that's sort of my identity formed around books. And first it was just wanting to be a reader and finding out all this stuff I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to know sometimes. And later it really became wanting to be a writer and at the time I wanted to be the signature writer of my generation. And I kept with that sort of grandiose idea right into college. After college, what I really wanted was any job that would allow me to write and pay me for writing, because that seemed like the path to writing that great novel.
Right. Okay.
And it didn't really work out that way, but it did keep me writing and keep me on the writing path.
Okay. And speaking of that, did you have any influences, maybe family or friends, or was it just the books that you read and that which influenced you wanting to be a writer?
I had some influences. Both my mom and my stepmom are, my stepmom is Jill. She got married to my dad when I was about 8. So in that whole process of the separation. And Jill was a very intellectually powerful scholar. And she was tough on me at times as a mom, but she also read everything and knew everything and was hardcore about intellectual life and academia and stuff. And she saw me as sort of soft, I think, and wanted to toughen me up intellectually, and it worked. At the same time, my mom was a huge reader and a psychology PhD. Jill was an anthropology PhD. Okay. And my mom sort of nurtured in me the love of literature more, whereas Jill was the love of scholarship and kind of a little more rigorous way of looking at it.
Okay. Now, moving forward, after high school, what college did you graduate from?
I went to Amherst College, which is a small liberal arts college in central Massachusetts. It's right next to UMass Amherst, which is more recognizable, I think, for people. I was the first person from my high school ever to go there, and it wasn't a place that many Californians went, New England, and I think I always wanted some of that, Exeter and Andover, New England prep school. And I always thought that they were sort of the smartest and toughest minded. I don't know that they were or not, but that's what I wanted, was to go to that kind of place. And it really their English department was just so strong. I had some really great professors who made me realize I'd been kind of limited in my reading and my understanding of what I cared about, and it opened it up. And suddenly I was really interested in a lot of other subjects than just novels and literature, politics and political theory and philosophy and history. And so that was a great 4 years for my mind. I didn't want to live in New England anymore after that, but I loved that time anyway.
Do you feel like that's where your interest in journalism came from when you were there?
I think it actually was earlier than that. I grew up reading the LA Times, and there was, I would skip everything and go straight to the sports section because I was a huge Dodger fan, still am. And in the LA Times, they had this great columnist named Jim Murray, who was sort of like your grandfather or like a great uncle. He was so personable, and I would read his column every day. He wrote every day. I would read his column, and he wrote it with such humanity and warmth and like love for his readers and his subjects. And that's when I realized, first of all, that good sports writing was the same as good other types of writing. He was writing features, essentially, that were just sports related. But also, that was when I I'd get excited every morning when I would open that paper, right? And we'd sit around with Jill and my dad, Rocky, and we'd sit around and they'd talk about what was in the front page, and I would pop in with sports facts. And that made me start to love journalism and writing more, I think.
Okay, cool. And speaking of journalism, when did you start your career? How did everything go, I guess, upon graduating college and then getting into that?
Well, I graduated college and started working the night shift at a grocery store called Smart and Final, where I had worked since I was 15, wrangling carts in the parking lot and cleaning up spills and doing, I was a box boy and bag boy and stuff. And by that time, I had risen to run the night shift. So it was me and a crew of dudes and there was no customers in the store, and we would just break down, a whole semi's worth of groceries and get it all faced in the store. And in that time, I was working with a guy. I was trying everything. I was getting interviewed for publishers, and I wanted to work in publishing or journalism, and just everyone wanted experience. No one gave me the time of day, so I just went back to the grocery store.
Well, I know how that is.
Yes, your Big Lots days.
Yes,
and I think those days helped me learn how to work. And one of the things that's helped me in my later career is that I really have that work ethic still. It's no thing to just really grind. And I think a lot of that comes from those days of, where I didn't want to be there, but I had to pay for my gas and car insurance. And so I was just there. And anyway, the point of the story is that I met a guy there who knew someone in the Oakland Tribune's corporate newspaper. They weren't a reporter, they worked in marketing. And so I interviewed for that job in marketing, and they knew I wanted to be a reporter and said, "We'll hire you, but you have to stay with us for a year." You can't just jump to one of the newspapers. And that was actually good because I started freelancing they had 8 papers in the chain, and I would freelance for the little papers, the Hayward, Daily Review, the Fremont Argus, other papers like that. And after a year, I was hired by the Argus, the smallest paper in the chain. Argus is a 1,000-eyed monster, which is a cool name for a newspaper.
Yeah.
And they had me doing night cops, which is basically I would come in at 1 in the afternoon. I was the fax distributor. That was back in the day of faxes and letters, and I would have to give everyone their mail and their faxes and do the obits. I would spend my afternoon writing obits. And then the cops reporter, whose name is Fariba Nawa, and she's actually a great writer. She was my mentor. She's Afghan-American and ended up writing a book about Afghanistan, and she's this international reporter in Istanbul now. I started just driving around with her on her rounds and started learning about police and how to cover them and courts and the like. And when she would have her story done, which is usually about 6 or 7, it would be my turn. So anything that happened, any disasters, fires, shootings, accidents, would be my story. And I started finding fun stories to write. Early on, I found one we called it Midnight Running. It was about the drag racers, this sort of impromptu drag racing subculture all around the the East Bay of San Francisco. I started following them around and chasing them with the police or just with them, trying to dodge the police, and got some really neat stories out of that. So they hired me as their primary cops reporter when Fariba moved on.
Okay.
And it was really fun, and I was good at it, and so I really liked that job.
Would you say that was your shoe in the door, so to speak?
Yes. I guess it was the freelancing, but that first job and being able to write law enforcement stories and go to court, and you realize as you're doing that editors have a hard time finding reporters who can handle that, who can handle law enforcement and dealing with court and schedules. And so the more I did it, the more I realized that was actually a valuable skill to be able to cover that stuff. And I started doing it more and more.
Still is.
Right. And later when I started covering the military, I realized that nobody wanted to cover court martials, because that's like court cases then on a military base where you have to have an escort and get approval and everything else. And it's just really tough.
Yeah.
So it helped me to have that early time with covering law enforcement in the courts and everything.
Okay, awesome. Speaking of military reporting, why did you choose to want to get involved with military reporting? Yeah,
it's funny. Even though I am from a military family, my dad, both grandparents and others were military. I've never served, but I've always been interested in it. I wanted to know more about what my grandfathers did, especially. But I never really covered the military at all until I had a student named James Laporta, a Marine. He had already been in the Marines for 8 years, and he had deployed twice to Afghanistan when he came to UNCW. And I met him. He came in to interview me, and I met him early before he was even in my classes. But later, he was in one of my classes. Mm-hmm. Actually, he was in a sports writing class, and he wrote nothing but investigative reporting that wasn't sports related in it, because I knew that's where he was going. And I said, sure, go ahead. Excuse me. And I started talking to him and covering military stories. The one that I got into first was a colonel that he had spent a lot of time with at Parris Island and Camp Lejeune. It was Colonel named Dan Wilson. Mm-hmm. And the colonel, he looked at him as like a father figure, James did, and it was really important to him. But the colonel had also gotten into some trouble and was leaving a trail of problems behind him. Some of them very serious problems, up to and including sexual misconduct and even sexual assault. And when James, who goes by Jim, but I call him James still, got wind of this, he really wanted to cover the story, but he didn't know if he could because he had a personal connection to Wilson. And he didn't know if that would make him biased or non-objective. So he said, would you cover it with me? And you can hold my feet to the fire so no bias gets in. And I said, sure, not realizing exactly what I was getting into on that story. It ended up being an absolute bear of a story. Wow. And James still had privileges at Camp Lejeune, his base where he had deployed from. So we just went on base and went and talked to all of the alleged victims. One of the alleged victims we did not talk to was an 8-year-old girl, but we talked to her parents.
Okay.
We also went to the brig, which is the Marines' version of a jail, yes. And interviewed Wilson in there. James did. I just sat there because I didn't have privileges to talk to him. But we spent about 8 hours crisscrossing Camp Lejeune, and the press information people were not happy about that at all. They were extremely betrayed by it. The reason we did it without checking in with them was that NCIS was mistrusted by the subjects, the alleged victims of Wilson. And Wilson was the chief of staff to the commanding general at Lejeune. Mm-hmm. So the perception among his alleged victims was that he was well protected and that NCIS couldn't be trusted and that everything would go back to Wilson. So James said to me, what do we do here? And I thought about it, and my response was, we do journalism, and we let the chips fall after. And so we did it. We talked to all those people. We left the base about midnight. By the next morning, James had been debarred. Wow. From his own home base. He could not go on it anymore. Me, they could just refuse to allow me entry, but they couldn't debar me because I wasn't a Marine.
Right.
And this court martial was coming up right then, and they decided to just let me get on there. But I was escorted like to the porta potty, put it that way, from that point on.
For those who don't know what that is, could you tell them?
Yes, when you are a civilian and you're on especially a journalist on a Marine base, at least. I'm not sure how they do it with Army.
Yeah, I think it might be the same.
I imagine it's probably very similar. You are escorted by usually a lieutenant at all times, and they take you to lunch at the burrito shack by the courthouse and to the bathrooms and everywhere. Just they like to have a very clear sort of handle on what people are doing on the base if they're not stationed at that base.
Yep. Very true. Now we're gonna move into this next segment. It's called Digging a Little Deeper. And so, even though you started talking about the military and having your student James, can you talk about how you got to North Carolina?
Yes. Again, it's back to my old wanting to write books thing. I was a reporter for about 6 years, and I had really loved it, but my time as a cops reporter came to an end because my little brother, Jeff, was killed in a car accident when he was 16. I was 25 and I was a cops reporter. Mm-hmm. And it affected me a great deal, as one would imagine.
Right.
And it started becoming really hard to go into other people's tragedies without feeling it. And I would go to like the scene of a car accident where 3 teenagers had been killed, and I was supposed to write a story about it. And I would talk to like their parents, and I would end up bawling, and like I couldn't continue really the interviews and stuff. And so even though I felt like I was really good at cops reporting, I kind of emotionally couldn't handle it anymore. Yeah. So I'd started doing some other types of jobs. I became a business reporter. The business editor said, "You really don't like this, do you?" I was like, "No, I don't." I was trying to investigate everyone, and he's like, "We don't really do that." And then I became a columnist, which was a really interesting and sort of freeing experience in journalism, but it wasn't what I wanted to do. I didn't like the exposure. I didn't like how people hated me or loved me, even though they didn't know me based on it. So I decided to get a Master of Fine Arts in creative writing. And I wanted to get out of the Bay Area. Even though I loved it there, I just didn't feel quite at home there. I started applying, looking into schools. I didn't know anything about it. And what I saw was that UNCW was, and then I cared more about rankings then. And UNCW was ranked like first or second in the country for creative nonfiction, which is what I wanted to do. At that point, I had made the shift from fiction over to creative nonfiction. Okay. And so I came here, I got waitlisted here and talked my way in, kind of, got in at the last second, and came here and got my MFA in the creative writing department. And I wasn't doing any journalism at the time. I was just writing nonfiction. Okay. And so that's how I ended up here and started writing again. But I didn't really get much published for quite a few years after I got my MFA. Okay. Well, I guess why did you choose to teach at UNCW? I sort of fell into it. What's lucky for me is that I love students. And I get a lot out of my interactions with them. And my students, I think, know that I'm loyal to them and that I look out for them. And I'm willing to talk to them about whatever in their lives, but also especially their intellectual pursuits and their work and their writing. So when I wanted to write books. I got an agent right when I got my MFA, and I was going to do that and make a career out of it, but it didn't happen. And I was picking up classes in the English department here because I needed to make ends meet, and I was at least trying to get some experience doing something else. And being an adjunct means you're a part-time professor making about $3,000 per class. It's a absolute indentured servitude wage. I did that for about 2 years trying to write, and I wasn't getting the book published. And finally, I applied for a full-time position in the English department because I knew I was good at it and liked it. Yeah. And they hired me as a lecturer, which is a full-time, non-tenured position. And that was just a temporary job in my mind, but I liked it and I found that I was good at it. And my favorite part about it was that over time I had, you were in this intellectual environment that was really fertile for thinking and for discovering new things. Yeah. And even though I wouldn't say my department has been particularly supportive of it, just because of the nature of the department and which degrees they recognize. It has helped to be in a intellectually open-minded place and a thinking place.
Okay. As a journalist, what are some ways that you have tried to make sure you're safe and especially like when you're dealing with uncovering things, especially like investigative journalism and things like that? What are you doing to try to make sure you're safe as a journalist?
I try to be smart about it and not put myself in positions where I'm vulnerable. There has been a couple times. The Wilson story was one where we got some death threats and pictures of us in our house with us in it. That someone had taken outside, and that was pretty disconcerting. James, as a Marine, got a lot more. He actually got a visit from the FBI from death threats. So I do take it seriously. But I also, there's a part of me that in journalism, you can't be macho. That is just not how you act. You're not a tough guy. But there is a toughness in journalism that is, I will not be intimidated by bullies. And that happened to me a couple times. Once by police intimidating me and bullying me in a very intense way.
I remember some of those stories.
Yeah, we won't have to get into that now. But and also by people I was writing about trying to use reporters for their own ends. And after being scared off, really it was the time by police, I made a vow to myself that I would never be bullied again. They could try, but it just wasn't going to work. And that actually worked. And they could tell when someone is not going to take it. Not that I was going to retaliate or anything, but I would just look them in the eye and just be like, it's not going to work. That served me really well for a long time. But then I had kids. I got married and I had kids. And some of the bullying is effective when you have a family you're worried about. Yeah. So I don't know. Really, I'm trying to be smart about it and pick my stories carefully. I'm not just investigating anybody who crosses my path, and I try to keep my family's safety in mind. But I also still have my value system, which is I'm no tough guy, but you can't bully me.
All right, I feel that way too. I think one thing that I've done as a journalist is I don't actually use my cell phone number. I use a Google number, so no one can track me.
Smart.
What is something that you wish someone would have told you earlier in your journalism career to help you succeed that you know now?
I think as a journalist coming up, I was really focused on the writing and how well it was written and how it came out and who thought I was a good writer. I also thought that I wanted to know it all, and I would sometimes act like that in front of subjects and be like, oh, I know that, trying to prove that I'm no dummy and that I know what they're talking about. And that was really the wrong way to go about it. It's much better as a journalist to be discreet, to just keep your thoughts to yourself, to pretend you don't know something, even when you do. And then when someone talks to you about it, you can judge their veracity, how much they're leveling with you, etc. So I think I went into journalism focused on showing everybody that I was as smart as them and that my writing was going to be my carrying piece. And then I realized over time, reporting is the key to journalism, not the writing. Writers, hate to say it, are a dime a dozen. Scoop machines at really good reporters are much harder to find. So I started keeping my mouth shut more, learning not to try to prove I knew stuff, but instead be very, very carefully using my knowledge or not using it in a way that helps me get better stories out of people and have better relationships within journalism and get more scoops.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Okay. Now, speaking of scoops, I think you have a second scoop of a book coming out in a few months. So I'm super excited about that. But before we talk about your next book, can we talk about your first one?
Yes.
Can you tell our listeners the name of it again and what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, it's called Aluminum Alley, and it's called that because Well, I'll tell you the story of the book, and it'll make it clear. The story of the book is that it's the story of the hump pilots. That's what they're called. The hump is the Himalayas. And they were about 3,000 young, a little over 3,000 young American pilots in a few other allied countries. This is in World War II, who were sent to India, halfway around the world, to fly supplies from India over Burma and the Himalayas, that's the hump, into China. And the purpose was to keep China alive in its war with Japan. It was a brutal invasion of China by Japan, and we were on China's side, and as we were fighting Japan. So my grandfather, Mel Hodel, and these thousands of other pilots were sent over there, and they flew bare bones cargo planes, non-insulated, over the Himalayas. And you can imagine about a third of them died. Yeah. It was the most dangerous cargo operation in World War II, and comparable to some of the casualty numbers of like the bombers and some of the highest casualty air missions. When I was writing military stories for the Washington Post, occasionally I would see others writing history about that, and I always thought, I would love to write my grandfather's story in the hump pilots. I never hear anything about these cargo pilots in the Himalayas, and that theater of World War II almost seems forgotten. People talk a lot about the Pacific and about the Nazis in Europe. They don't talk much about China and Asia, but we actually had a very major combat theater there. Yeah. So, when I was writing this book, I wanted to write it not just about the leaders, but about the regular people. My grandfather was one of them, the regular pilots who just did this job they were assigned and didn't know why they were there or how long it was going to take. But I want to really focus on them and their experiences, because I feel like the leaders, the generals, has been written, but not many people have written about the regular soldiers and airmen who are over there. And what I found was that the stories were incredible. And as a nonfiction writer, I don't make up, I don't have any control over the facts. I just have the presentation. But in this case, the facts were so fascinating that it was a lot of fun doing the research and pulling it together into a coherent narrative.
I always say real life is better than reality TV. So
there's some stuff in this book that would not work in fiction. It's just too crazy and weird. You're like, no way, but it's nonfiction, so it's real.
What is the name of your second book that'll be coming out? And tell us when it will be coming out.
Okay, my second book comes out in May, I think, though I think that's still up in the air. It could be June. It is called Delivery Man. It is the story of this. My subheading is The Enemy Alien Nisei Translator Who Saved His Battalion in World War II. Oh, wow. So Enemy Alien, this is the story of Roy Matsumoto. Is his name. I haven't told anyone this because I wanted to keep the suspense up. So I haven't told people what the story is about because it's so good.
It's an exclusive here, guys.
Yes, this is the real thing. So the story is of Roy Matsumoto, who was a Japanese-American guy who lived in LA, and he was a delivery boy. He described himself as a delivery boy. And he knew sort of everything about the Japanese diaspora in Los Angeles, which was a really big one. That's where most Japanese immigrants moved. They were from Seattle, San Francisco, and Southern California a lot. And so he was there just working. He was born in Los Angeles, so an American citizen. And then Pearl Harbor happened. And within weeks after Pearl Harbor, the internment of Japanese Americans began. And he was first sent to Santa Anita Racetrack, which was in LA. Seabiscuit had won a race there 2 years before. It was the premier racetrack in LA. They turned it into a concentration camp.
I didn't know that.
And that's where he was for 6 months. He was cutting vegetables in the mess for there. And then he was shipped, after 6 months, he was shipped to Jerome, Arkansas, to a second concentration camp. I use that term because Franklin Roosevelt used that term. It didn't have the connotations of the Nazis yet at the time, and it was a concentration camp. He was stuck in Arkansas, very bitter about being an American citizen in prison, essentially. Yeah. And he heard from his brother, who was already who had joined the military before Pearl Harbor and thus was not interned, that there was this group that they needed infantry soldiers in the army, and they really needed Japanese speakers. And it went from being a sign of suspicion and something that could get you interned to being something that the military really needed.
Yeah.
So he managed to get out of the camp by enlisting, out of the Jerome camp by enlisting. And they sent him to language school, and he became a Nisei. And that's when I said in the subhead, enemy alien was what they called Japanese Americans, even citizens, when they put them into the concentration camps.
Okay.
And the Nisei were really any soldier of Japanese ancestry or ethnicity, but they became also synonymous with the translators, the language specialists, linguists. And so he became attached to an infantry unit as their translator, and they trained him as both infantry and language, and then sent him over to basically the harshest battlefield on earth, which was the Burma jungle. And he was embedded as part of Merrill's Marauders, arguably the U.S., the Americans' first special forces. They were a jungle crew, a long-range penetration unit, and they were fighting a brutal jungle war. And at one point, they're basically besieged. They're trapped in northern Burma, and they're taking fire from all sides. They're losing men all the time, and they're facing actual annihilation. They're all going to be killed. But Roy Matsumoto crawls across the zone in between the two camps and listens to a Japanese commander ordering an attack for the next morning. He's silent. He is on the ground for over an hour, just listening and remembering it. He can't cough, can't breathe, barely.
Wow.
And he then manages to crawl back to his own base in the middle of the night and help them set up an ambush on the next morning at dawn the next morning.
That's pretty awesome. And
basically all these guys who lived say, Roy Matsumoto saved us. He is the hero of it, that he saved the battalion. In the middle of the ambush, I'll just give one little tidbit here.
Okay.
The middle of the ambush, Roy Matsumoto stands up and impersonates a Japanese officer and screams at the Japanese troops to continue their push right into machine gun fire.
Wow.
So he commands them, and they listen because his Japanese is so good. He even knows their dialect.
Oh my
And
God.
They listen and they charge into the Americans' trap.
Wow. That is crazy.
So it's pretty amazing
that
what he
needs to
did.
Be a movie.
He really is. I wrote this and I thought, who is an incredibly talented and handsome 30-year-old or 25-year-old Japanese American actor? Because this actor cannot be Chinese American.
Yeah.
This actor must be Japanese or Japanese American.
Yeah.
And I think I get real excited about this one.
I'm excited for you.
I do think it would make a great movie. I just have to get it into the hands of people who make movies somehow.
Well, you're in the right area, I think.
Yeah.
Wilmington does that.
Right. And I've already told people, I'm sending you a review copy of this because I think somebody you know might like it.
Yeah. Okay. What are the differences between being a book writer and being a journalist writing a news story?
I mean, the obvious one is speed. Journalism is the first draft of history. I'm trying to write a final draft, not a final draft, but
yeah.
And so it's much different in that way, not having a deadline. Deadlines help me. I need a deadline to push me and to keep me on track. Mm-hmm. And with books, there are some deadlines, but they're so far off that you can get lost in your timing and stuff.
Gotcha.
I had to learn how to write a book. It was a lot different from journalism. And what it did was it made me a lot more organized, and it made me, more careful with information, realizing that there is no editor who's going to find every error. So I have to be the first editor, and find all those errors and be more critical of your own writing. You tend to fall in love with your own writing and think, oh, it's fine. And you're not looking at it like an editor would.
Right.
And so I guess becoming my own editor, even though I've also got really good editors now with the book, is a big difference. And journalism, you can also sort of move on from. The stakes are higher with books. If there's anything wrong with it, or I don't think it matters to me that much if it does well or not. what matters to me is the book itself and the product being something that I'm proud of, that has its own kind of existence away from me, that it goes out there in the world and does its thing.
Right.
And I love that. And journalism, I feel like, is kind of over after a day or two, whereas people are still writing me about this book. You know, my grandfather or my father was, you know, fought in World War II, and I loved reading your book about this and that. And I love that it's sort of out there doing its thing, you know, and I just check in on it at times.
That's pretty cool. Where can people get your book from?
It's everywhere. Like, it's not at many bookstores, to be honest. I see it occasionally at a bookstore, but it's on Amazon and Goodreads. And I think you can buy it directly from the publisher, which is called Stackpole, kind of a famous military publisher. I've read a bunch of their books for this. And so most people, I think, just get it on Amazon.
Yeah, I just remember clicking some link and I was like, oh, I'm going to pre-order this. I pre-ordered your book.
Nice, thank you.
Yeah, I just wanted to go on record saying that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to when this next one is available for pre-order. I haven't seen the book cover yet or anything.
Okay. Are you excited about the graphics that you'll be using? Because I know you guys can't see it, but he has pictures on the back of the book of this one. So what are the graphics going to be like on the new one?
Well, I got a few photos, at least the commitment to use a few photos from Roy Matsumoto's family. So his daughter is still alive, Karen Matsumoto, and she became like a friend of mine during this. Wow. She's this really smart, well-educated woman who knows everything about like the Japanese American experience in America, especially World War II, because her dad played such a prominent role. And she not only offered some photos and gave me other information, but she read and fact-checked the Matsumoto parts. So
that's awesome.
And it was really hard to piece together the long family tree. They're mostly from Hiroshima.
Okay.
And then they bifurcated. Half went to California, the other half stayed in Hiroshima, and they go back and forth. So she helped me get all that straight, the whole family lineage and where they had all been when. And I think it made the book way better. And she also helped me on some of the Japanese American issues from internment and that era. So
because we weren't there, so having someone know something secondhand.
And she wasn't either, but she has studied it and heard from her parents so much that she was really, really helpful.
Well,
so I'm excited about the graphics and also some of these personal stories that, again, it's a regular soldier, not a general or a president. I mean, those guys are in there too, but I really like getting into the life of a Nisei translator fighting with the infantry in Burma against the Japanese. And it's such a distinct experience.
I feel like we're not going to want to put the book down. Like when you start, you're going to be like trying to read it while you're at work.
I hope not.
Y'all all right.
I hope you can't put it down.
All right. This next segment is called Shout 'Em Out. Do you know any nonprofit organizations that you are interested in or you support that you'd like to share with our listeners?
The one that comes to mind for me would be the Cape Fear Literacy Council, which does a lot of really good work with students and young people in this area, all the way up, from young kids and some with reading disabilities and things like that, up to college students, more high school students. And I think that we're in a time where reading is starting to fall away, and I think it's really important. I have some students, I have had students who are barely literate, and what I tell them is, you are incredibly smart and a badass because you are doing this you are hustling without those skills. And usually it's like a mild dyslexia or something that they can treat. Mm-hmm. So I'd say, what about just working on this? Imagine what you could do if you didn't have to hustle about reading and you could just read what you want. And I love any organization that's helping students, because when they do make that transition, it's like the world opens up to them.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are really embarrassed about their reading, and they just need a little help to get to a point where they can really read better. Sometimes it's actual literacy. Other times it's like being able to do your schoolwork and write an essay, stuff like that. So I think that's really important, and I like that one.
Okay, awesome. How can our listeners reach out to them?
To the Cape Fear Literacy Council?
Yes, in case you're interested and you're in Wilmington.
That's a great question. I don't really know what to say other than to Google them and check their page. They have a pretty good online operation to get involved if that's something people want to do.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing that. All right, this last segment is one of my favorites. It's called Rants with Sharice. Tell us about something that gets under your skin, and it can be anything. You can talk about not using signal lights while driving, people not using washcloths, whatever you want. But after you tell us about what you don't like, you have to tell our listeners how to fix a situation. So the floor is yours.
Okay. I think, personally, one thing I care about a lot, I care about people more than anything, but one issue I care a lot about is environmentalism, ecology, climate change, and all of the related issues. And what bothers me, my rant would probably be about living in a place like Wilmington, which I really love more than almost anywhere, probably anywhere I've ever lived, including my, hometown and everything like that. But it bothers me when people take for granted the natural environment we have here, which is beautiful and irreplaceable, and people come from thousands of miles just to be in it for a little bit.
Yeah.
And when I see people who are thoughtless or some issues like trawling and overfishing and other sort of environmental destruction, that's my pet peeve, my serious disturbance. And I really, I think people have made it political, and I want to educate them on how it really doesn't matter. It's not political. It's really about like our birthright and the one we're trying to pass on to people who come after us.
Yes.
And I think the best remedy for it is definitely education, but it's getting out there, because when my students or people from out of town come and I take them out on kayaks or paddle boards on the marsh, or we go take the boat out to Masonboro Island, they think, I've never seen anything like this. And it's almost better than any argument or any white paper that you can say about how you should try to support the environment. It's if you get them out there and they see it and they fall in love with it, and then they want to. And then they want to try to preserve it. And they don't want to do the thoughtless things that damage it.
And what are some of those thoughtless things that they're doing out there?
Trawling is a big one, and fishing in the estuaries, which North Carolina allows gill net fishing in the estuaries. So that's a big problem. But then it's also overdevelopment along the coasts. And we have a big problem with rising sea levels. And North Carolina is preferring to bury its head in the sand and keep insurance rates low and sort of ignore climate change. I think that is a big problem that cannot last. I think it's one of the biggest problems of our era and our age. And so the remedy is education and immersion in it. And I think people will come around, at least in this kind of area, but I don't know about our whole country. Right. But I can only really influence, I feel like, the people in my surroundings now. So that's where I like to try to push. Okay.
And what should they be doing out here? It's probably like picking up trash, I assume.
Well, there's definitely all of the, trash cleanups and the like, but I really think it's spending time in it, learning respect for it, like what doesn't damage it, how to leave nothing but footprints, and then it's sharing that love for it with other people in your life, your family, your friends, and that. And I think that makes a big difference to people. They often think, oh, climate change doesn't affect me. It's remote from me. But when you're out there and you can see the rising tides and the beautiful estuaries, you think, okay, this actually does have some bearing on my life.
Yep. Agreed. Before you go, can you tell everyone where they can find you at on social media or an email or wherever you're at out there so they can follow you?
Yes, I am I'm on Facebook because I'm old, and Rory Laverty, R-O-R-Y, Laverty. And I am on Instagram and also Rory Laverty. I am on TikTok now, though I don't know what I'm doing there.
Me either.
I'm trying because I've heard talk books is very important, TikTok books. I'm also on Twitter. I don't post much on Twitter because the current manifestation X, I think, is a bit of a cesspool, but there's still a lot of good journalism on there. Yeah. So I'm also just at Rory Laverty on there. And if anyone wants to just write me, Rory Laverty at Gmail. And I would love to hear from you.
All right. Well, Thank you so much for sharing this platform with me today and being vulnerable. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Charisse. It's really a pleasure, and I love being here with one of my former students now, a journalism pro, so it's great for me too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And thank you for listening to Connect Like Minds. All right, we're good.
All right. That was good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How did I do? Did I do all right?
You're awesome, yeah.